Welcome to today's webinar, A Deeper Dive, Lessons Learned About Improving Attendance Among Our Most Vulnerable Students. Before we get started, I would like to share some brief details about today's webinar. Our presenters are from Attendance Works, a national and state initiative that promotes awareness of the important role that school attendance plays in achieving academic success, starting with school entry. Our first speaker today is Sue Fothergill, Associate Director for Policy with Attendance Works. Today's webinar will last for approximately 60 minutes with time for questions. We will be placing everyone is off mute right now, but if you could go ahead and mute yourselves, that would be great. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the chat function in the gray bar at the top of your screen. Please feel free to log your questions as the presenters are talking, and we'll leave some time at the end to answer them. If we don't have enough time to get through all of the questions, we will reply to all participants by email within the next 5 to 7 days. We encourage you to ask questions or simply share a comment. Today's webinar is one of a number being offered by the Technical Assistance Center during 2017. The center is new. It is funded by the Department of Education, specifically the Office of Safe and Healthy Students. Our website is currently being developed, and we hope to have it up and running soon. Before I hand over to Sue, I wanted to share with you the mission of our National Center. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. Sue, I pass it on to you now.
So Chantal, this is actually Hetty. So
Hi,
I
Hetty.
think I was going to take it and do the agenda and serve as the moderator throughout this, and then I will hand it off to Sue. So thanks so much, Chantal, and why don't you switch to the next slide. This is Hetty Chang. I'm the Executive Director of Attendance Works. So pleased to be here and have everyone on the phone.
Everyone, please mute yourselves.
If you are both on a computer and also on on your phone listening in, that's where we'll get that double extra echo. But it looks like we managed to make it go away. In any case, let me start off with telling you a little bit about our agenda. As Chantal mentioned, we are actually going to hear from Sue Fothergill, the Associate Director of Policy for Attendance Works, and she'll briefly talk about the impact of chronic absence and some frameworks for taking action. In addition, we are going to have a chance to really take a deeper dive. I'm going to still ask folks to make sure they're muted because I'm hearing a little bit of extra background noise. And we're going to have
our speakers. Also our speakers, if they could mute themselves until it's their turn. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. So we're going to have a chance to really hear about what are strategies for improving attendance among our most vulnerable students. We'll start with Casey Shute with the National Center for Youth Law. Then we'll have Sarah Jonas and Sarah Peterson talk about how they are particularly using their Success Mentor strategy and using it to address the needs of homeless kids and kids who have unstable housing. And then the last speaker on our panel is Ellie Rossiter, who's been doing an amazing job working with Hope SF from the San Francisco Foundation, really looking at how do they address the needs of kids who are in public housing. And with that, after that end of that, we will have a chance to talk, have a little bit of a cross-cutting discussion, and we'll take questions from the chat. With that, Sue, can you give us a little background here? Thank you so much.
I can. Thank you, Hetty. So to begin with, I want to ensure that we all have a common definition of chronic absence. And so chronic absence measures when students miss 10%
and so
or
let
more.
me ask Chantal to please move the next slide.
Yes, thank you. 10% or more of their days on roll. It is different than average daily attendance, which measures the average number of students that show up each day, or truancy, which is only a measure of unexcused absences. Next slide, please. It's easy not to notice when a student may be missing too much school. 10% of a school year is about 18 days of absence, and that sounds like a lot, but when you break it down, that's just 2 days a month or more. Most parents don't get too stressed out if their child misses 2 days of school in a month, and many schools and school districts don't currently monitor for chronic absence. But when it happens month after month, it becomes a problem. Next slide. As a nation, we must acknowledge that chronic absence can be devastating to a child's future. Research has shown a strong correlation between frequent absences and student outcomes. Students who are chronically absent in the early grades are much less likely to read at grade level. And we know that when students don't read at grade level by third grade, they are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. And by secondary school, chronic absence is a better predictor of high school dropout than test scores. Next slide. Working to reduce chronic absence can serve as a unifying common goal and an effective tool for resource allocation and an easy-to-understand measure of progress and success. Next slide. Solving chronic absence begins with identifying for your school or community what are the most significant drivers for chronic absence, especially for our most vulnerable populations. And of those, where are the opportunities to connect the relationship between student absenteeism and supporting student social, emotional, and physical health? Next slide. The framework to reduce chronic absence is built on a public health model and begins with prevention. The foundation of chronic absence prevention is creating a welcoming and engaging school environment with strong site-based attendance practices and approach to using data to coordinate and organize a multi-tiered system of support. Taking action in Tier 2 requires the common understanding the common causes of frequent absences among students, and then developing, implementing, and monitoring prevention and intervention strategies. And when you do intensive work for Tier 3 kids, like a coordinated case-managed approach, it isn't enough without making sure that they are welcome into school and have positive personalized support from people in the building. In many ways, it is our most vulnerable populations of students who might feel most alienated from school. The shift from truancy to chronic absence invites a holistic problem-solving process. Cross-sector partnerships and multi-tiered strategies help schools and school districts transform their efforts and make a difference for children and adolescents. Next slide. Cross-sector partnerships can help schools strengthen their tiered intervention strategies by working with schools in each tier to better serve students. Next slide. And finally, it is important to undergird all of this work with a common understanding that in communities with concentrations of chronic absence and poverty, schools and communities must realize the widespread impact of trauma and design supportive environments that recognize that healing happens in healthy relationships. And with that, Hetty, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Can we have the next slide? And now you can see our panelists with all their wonderful pictures. So we have, again, Casey, who's going to really talk to us about the fabulous work that they're doing around changing outcomes for kids, particularly in child welfare, but also in for the kids who are working connected to the juvenile justice system. We'll again have Sarah Jonas and Sarah Peterson, who are from the New York City Department of Education, talking about the strategies that they've been putting in place at scale, but particularly keeping in mind the needs of kids who are struggling with housing. And then Ellie Rossiter, the director of the Partnership for Hope SF, is going to be talking more in depth about the work they're doing for kids who are in challenged public housing settings. So with that, Casey, can you tell us more about what do we know about lessons learned for addressing the needs of kids in child welfare?
I'd love to. Thanks, Hetty, and thanks to everyone on the webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the work that Posterize is doing. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Foster Ed. We're an initiative of the National Center for Youth Law, which is an Oakland-based nonprofit, and we operate in multiple states, working to build a reality where the vast majority of system-involved youth graduate high school with the widest array of possibilities for their future. And like Hetty mentioned, when we talk about system-involved youth, we really mean both youth in the child welfare system and also those in the juvenile justice system. And the way we do our work is by ensuring that those students are positively engaged in school and learning, are empowered to take charge of their educational futures, and have meaningful relationships with caring adults who can support their educational success. And the way I like to shorthand that is that our definition of success is that we really want students to be empowered, academically engaged, and have strong relationships, strong and supportive relationships. Next slide, please. So this is our Posterize practice framework, and as you can see there on the left, we start working with students when they enter state care supervision, again, the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system. And then there's 3 core components to our practice framework. The first is that we ensure that each student in care is supported by an education champion. And when I talk about education champions, what we really mean is one identified adult who can be a strong advocate or champion for that youth and who really self-identifies in that role. So we often work with biological parents, particularly when the long-term plan is for the student to go back home, because we know that for most students in the child welfare system, they are actually going to end up back living with their parents in the long term. So the more that we can engage those parents and build their capacity to be effective educational advocates, the longer the benefits will accrue, because the student will continue to gain from those advocacy skills.
Sorry about that.
The parent.
Okay. Hi, Casey. Let me just interrupt real quick. If folks could please mute. Correct. That would be really helpful because someone's talking and we're hearing you. So if you could mute, and then sure. If in addition people could, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and at the end of Casey's presentation, we'll come back to it. But again, I'd really like for everyone to please mute. Thank you.
Okay, I will. All right, bye.
Yeah.
Whoever just said bye, we need you to mute, please, because we're hearing your conversation. Thank you.
And I'll try to be proactive and ask to please not put us on hold, since everyone's unmuted. If you put us on hold and we get hold music, that'll be a problem. So I talked about our work with education champions, and I was talking about how we often work with biological parents as education champions, but oftentimes the biological parent isn't in a situation to play that role, either because the long-term plan isn't reunification or the parents they need to focus on other things related to their case plan. And there we'll work with relatives, we'll work with foster parents, we'll work with corner point and special advocates, CASAs. So we're pretty broad in who we can identify as education champions. We really just want one identified adult who can play that role. Second component of our practice framework is work with education teams. And this is really related to the fact that we know students who are system involved have a lot of adults in their lives. Social workers, probation officers, therapists, school side staff, foster parents, and these people from different systems aren't always working in a coordinated and collaborated way to support the student around education. So we try to really build that team-based infrastructure and get everyone on the same page, everyone working collaboratively and communicating effectively, so that the approach to supporting the student in education is really one of a true team. And then finally, the third and final part of our practice framework is student-centered engagement. And this really refers to our education liaisons, which is we call our case managers, using positive youth development principles to build strong connections directly with that young person. And that takes the form of working with the youth to say, what are your long-term educational goals? What do you want to get out of education? And how can we lay out some steps for you to achieve those goals? And what are some of the obstacles you're facing at school? And how can we jointly problem solve to work through some of that? So that gets back to really that empowerment approach, where we want to work directly with the youth and partner with them so that they can be the drivers of their educational future and do some of their own troubleshooting and problem solving and proactive goal setting. And then the result, hopefully, is that the student, again, graduates with the widest array of possibilities for their future. Next slide, please. So I just want to touch really briefly on what the research shows around foster youth attendance, really just to highlight why this is an important issue. And the research consistently shows that students in foster care experience really high rates of student mobility. And this is both in terms of school transfers, but also in terms of placement transfers, so changes in their living situation. And that mobility really negatively impacts attendance. And that isn't to say that those rates of mobility are the only things that students in care experience that negatively impact attendance. There's also just more general instability in terms of adults coming in and out of their lives, and then also the real significant impacts of trauma. And collectively, some of those factors really can have an impact on attendance. So just a couple of quick data points. One is from a 2014 report from Chapin Hall, which found that about a third of California students at least a month of school at some point due to changes in their home placement. And then there's also a study from Philadelphia that followed a cohort of children and found that those children missed twice as many school days as children in the district overall. So this is just a couple of examples of what we see in the research, but the research pretty consistently shows that students in care struggle with attendance more than their peers. And just another reminder to please mute yourself if you're on the line, and then if we can get the next slide, that would be great. So with that said, in terms of some of the challenges, what is foster ed doing to work to improve student attendance for youth in care? I want to talk first about the work we do with Education Champions. And really one of the first strategies is just to work with Education Champions to make sure that they understand the importance of consistent attendance. Sue mentioned earlier that there can be, the slide talked about some of the myths in terms of that attendance isn't important or that a consistent attendance isn't really a key to educational success. And we really work with our Education Champions to talk about the fact that that's not the case and that consistent attendance really is important. And then we also, for the second bullet there, drill down a little bit to say, okay, now that we have talked about the importance of attendance, what are some of the strategies that you can use to encourage the student to attend school regularly? And again, given that a lot of our Education Champions are biological parents who aren't living with their students, a lot of that is troubleshooting around, okay, so the student lives in a foster home. Well, what can you do, even though you're not putting them to bed at night, what can you do in your weekly visits with your child or in your nightly phone calls to talk to them about how they're doing in school and why it's important to go to school and do set up the long-term plan, or I should say the long-range vision for why, attending school now can help you achieve this down the road. And then a final strategy is improving communication between school and home to encourage and ensure regular attendance. And similarly, again, though we don't exclusively work with biological parents as Education Champions, we do work with a lot of, for the most part, as biological parents. And we find that when students are living in foster care, the schools often communicate and work directly with the foster parents, and the biological parents can get left out of it, even though they have a commitment to supporting their children and they have a strong role to play. So we work with those Education Champions, and really whether it's the biological parents or a relative or anyone else, to say, you really should be involved. You should be talking to the school. You should connect with the school to make sure that the student's attending regularly and be getting updates. And if there are issues, how can we address those? So that's not a comprehensive list. I just wanted to highlight in the time I have a few key strategies we use in our work with Education Champions to improve student attendance. Next slide, please. So moving on to the work we do with education teams to improve student attendance. I can really summarize these three bullets in saying that what we do is we bring team members together, and in that team-based infrastructure, we set up a plan for the students. So what are some of the goals for this youth, and particularly some of the goals around attendance? And then we go further than that and say, okay, so we've set this goal. What are some of the associated action steps and intermediate milestones we want to see to achieve it? And then further, okay, so for each team member, what is it that you can do to really support this goal? So an example would be instead of, let's take a student who has some attendance challenges. We would set the goal to say, we want them attending school 100% of the time. But then we go further and say, okay, what are some of the intermediate milestones we might see? If they're attending school now at 60%, we want to track the progress and make sure we hit 70 and then 80 and then 90. And then furthermore, what can each of us do? So maybe social worker, in your monthly visit with the student, can you make sure you talk about attendance and ask them how it's going? And if you visit the school, pull the attendance record to see how it is. And then therapist, same thing, in your one-on-one sessions with the youth, can you talk about attendance and see how it's going? School side staff, can you check in with the youth, and if there are attendance challenges, see where some of that's coming from. And referring back to the tiers we talked about earlier, we also hope that our work with school side staff and talking about some of the work we do with individual students, that'll inform the greater school culture, because we know that working with individual youth and encouraging them to attend school isn't going to have as much of an impact or a benefit if there are school culture problems, if there are school climate problems, if their trauma isn't being adequately considered. So we hope that our more focused Tier 3 interventions that I'm talking about will also inform some of the Tier 1 approaches that creates a better learning environment universally. Next slide,
Casey,
please.
Can I just ask a quick question on that particular aspect before you go to your effectiveness one?
Yeah, please do.
What in particular, what have you found works to go from the team working with a Tier 3 to helping inform a school about its Tier 1?
So what we focus on a lot is that, and so I'll actually just take trauma because widely recognized as important in educating students, and particularly among foster youth. But so we make sure that when we are talking about an individual youth in this team-based structure, and we're talking about trauma, there's a lot of expertise that comes to that from that team, from that group, and it may be there may be information and approaches that the school side staff haven't heard before, and then we can say, we're talking about foster youth who experience a disproportionately high level of trauma, but this is something that can benefit your students across the board, across the school. So when we talk about this particular student, we really benefit because of the trauma they've experienced from a warmer welcome at the beginning of the day, or more understanding around why they may be exhibiting some of the behaviors that they're exhibiting. This doesn't need to be something that only happens with the student, and it's something that if you think about adopting school-wide, we know from trauma-informed classrooms and from multi-tier systems of support that it's going to benefit the school more generally. Did that answer the question, Hetty? I'll take that as yes. So moving on to I just really want to quickly talk about our evaluation, some of our results. So we work in Santa Cruz County in California, and we actually tracked the attendance of the youth that we worked with. And so about 2/3 of the students who started working with foster ed and weren't attending school very regularly were actually able to increase their attendance rates, and that's the graph you see at the right. And the vast majority of students who actually had a high attendance rate when they entered foster ed were able to maintain it. So next slide, please. So that's my presentation for the day. There's my contact information. Anyone can feel free to reach out if you want to talk further about foster ed's work or work generally with foster youth or youth involved in the juvenile justice system. And with that, I will turn it back to Hetty.
Great. I'm wondering, though, does anyone have any questions for Casey? We are going to have a time for cross-cutting questions at the end. But if you have anything specific about foster ed, you should do it now, or let us know now. Casey, we're going to come back to you because I think there's actually a lot to explore about what it means to work across different kinds of vulnerable student populations. And with that, I'm going to ask Sarah Peterson and Sarah Jonah to join us. They are from New York City, the Department of Ed, which has had such an incredible and powerful approach to looking at chronic absence as a school district. So with that, I'd like to open it up to them. And Dantel, why don't you switch to the next slide, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
I am actually listening to a webinar on the
Sarah, before you go, the person who is saying I'm actually listening to a webinar,
what time would be
you really need to put yourself on mute. Thank you.
I think this will last until 4 o'clock.
I think this is not working, Sarah Jonah. So I'm going to let you try to go. These are the challenges of technology.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so I'll continue. So thank you, everyone, and I'm going to kick
us off. I'll give you a call back in a little bit.
For the little bit about the work we're doing here in New York City with our Every Student Every Day initiative. Next slide, please.
Sarah, I'm going to give one try. Whoever just said goodbye, because you said you told someone that you were listening to a webinar, could you please put yourself on mute if you're listening now? Thank you so much. Sorry, Sarah. They've been coming in and out this entire webinar. I just wanted to give it one more shot.
No worries. Okay. So we have two objectives for this portion of the webinar. The first is to share an overview of our Every Student Every Day initiative here in New York City that's designed to increase attendance and decrease chronic absenteeism for students, including our most vulnerable students. And secondly, we'll be discussing how to scale this type of work so that you could implement these strategies and this approach in any school district to support your vulnerable students and families. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share a little bit about the 3 key strategies that we employ through our Every Student Every Day campaign. They are training and professional development related to our success mentoring approach, innovative data support, and targeted resources. So I'm going to speak briefly on each one of these strategies. So the first, the training and professional development for success mentors. In a moment, I'm going to speak a little bit more to the specifics of success mentoring, but for this slide, important to know that success mentors are caring adults who are paired with chronically absent students, including students in temporary housing, as well as other vulnerable students, to help support positive attendance and decrease chronic absence. We provide a range of professional development for our success mentors, and this includes training on how to identify students who are experiencing housing instability, so sort of what are the signs, training on trauma-informed practice, so what are the signs of trauma and how to best support students who are experiencing trauma. Training in domestic violence, again, sort of what are the signs that a young person is experiencing this in his or her life, and what types of resources are most important to connect those students to. And also training and support around how to effectively partner with and communicate with staff in homeless shelters so that we can help coordinate the supports to our students who are experiencing housing instability. The second key strategy on the slide around innovative data supports refers to an innovative data tool that we've developed here in New York City DOE, which incorporates data on attendance, behavior, and coursework, so those ABCs that we often speak about when talking about the sort of holistic approach for chronically absent students. And what's really exciting about that data tool is that it is available both to school partners and to their community-based organization partners who sign a confidentiality agreement to access that data. And that data tool includes data on students in temporary housing. So it includes a flag for students who we know are experiencing housing instability and helps ensure that schools and their partners are able to identify those students and direct appropriate supports and resources to those students. That's really important because we so often hear that one of the major challenges in this work is not knowing who those students are who are experiencing housing instability. And the third and final sort of prong of this strategy is targeted resources. We have e-blasts and a success mentor guide and sort of weekly tips that go out to schools and partners specifically on how to support the most vulnerable students with positive attendance. And that again includes specific information around supporting students in temporary housing and other vulnerable students and families. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more here on what is a success mentor. I mentioned this in the previous slide. So success mentors, in addition to being sort of paired with chronically absent students, it's important to note here that any caring adult or peer can be a success mentor. So we have success mentors in our program who are security guards, teachers, community-based partners, folks who work in the lunchroom or cafeteria in our schools. Any caring adult can be a success mentor. And we found that for our students who are experiencing homelessness, social work interns make particularly good success mentors because they have expertise and training in how to support homeless students and their families, as well as a knowledge base around the particular kinds of challenges that these students face, such as those that I mentioned earlier, trauma, domestic violence, and other types of issues that we know occur at higher rates for students in temporary housing. Our success mentors engage in a host of activities, including a daily meet and greet, where they welcome students warmly to school and encourage them to keep coming. Positive phone calls home, which are made in a positive tone to families, letting families know that we've noticed your child is missing today, we miss your child, and is there anything we can do to support you in helping get your child back to school and coming regularly. And finally, as I mentioned, helping to connect students and families, including our most vulnerable students, to targeted community resources. And for more information, we have a page on our website. There's a link to that on the slide here. We have a page of resources on working with students in temporary housing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Peterson.
Great. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about how to scale up every student every day to support these most vulnerable youth. Our office, the Office of Community Schools at the Department of Education in New York City, oversees and helps to manage 150 community schools in New York. In a community school, community-based organizations serve key partners to schools. Chronic absence rates in our community schools run as high as 60%. Many of these chronically absent youth are students in temporary housing. In fact, 2,500 families are in shelters right now, but 100,000 students have been identified as homeless, meaning, according to McKinney-Vento, they are in foster care, doubled up, in shelter, and so on. Today, the Every Student Every Day campaign rolls out in 119 of our community schools. Over 15,000 students, including 4,000 of them being students in temporary housing, are assigned to a success mentor. And we know that Every Student Every Day is working. Next slide. Next slide. Students with a mentor gain 6 additional, go to the prior slide that says impact. Students with a mentor gain 6 additional days of school compared to the prior year in 2015-16 as compared to students without a mentor. These students were chronically absent and through that personalized attention attended more often. So not only does Bob Belfance's research point to this, but we have evidence to show that is true too in our community schools in 2015-16. Majority of our schools were implementing the weekly meeting. The weekly meeting is a way for the school to organize itself around data, to drive decisions using data and not anecdote around the challenge of chronic absence. We offer a video here to see what that weekly meeting looks like. It's available also on our website, which is www.communityschools.nyc. Over 50,000 students have been assigned to services to date, from tutoring, mentoring, counseling, robotics, physical activity, you name it, both before school, during school, after school, and on weekends. And it's all done in concert with a community-based organization to address the challenge of chronic absence and supporting our most vulnerable youth. Next slide. So how did we get here? New York City did not reach 10,000 chronically absent students, which include many students in temporary housing, overnight. We took small incremental steps over several years to achieve this scale. For school districts that are interested in adopting Every Student Every Day, like New York City did, I'm going to share 4 key tips to scaling based on our experience. The number one tip, the number one thing is political will. And that political will could be a principal in a school. In our case, it was key leaders within City Hall and the Department of Education who became champions of the work, highlighting for schools across the city that a key way to reduce chronic absence is to adopt Every Student Every Day. Number 2, flexible funding. We tapped state funding with flexible parameters called Attendance Improvement and Dropout Prevention Funds to launch the work in 2014-15. We started with 45 community schools in our first year and have grown to 150 today. Now, we leverage 49 community-based organizations across the 5 boroughs to help 150 schools do, among other things, build out the Success Mentor and Social Work Success Mentor Core, the latter which includes partnering with local universities like Columbia and Hunter College. 3, and next slide, please. Our third tip for success and scaling is to build capacity. We identified partners at Mentor, which is a national organization. They offer free services through a grant, National Center for Community Schools, and United Way to help us roll out trainings for schools and mentor on the tenets of Every Student Every Day, which includes, in addition to success mentoring and the data tools, drawing on community resources to meet student needs. And fourth and finally, the 4th tip, and maybe my most favorite, is establishing an early warning tool, both at the school level and at the district level. And those 2 tools should talk to each other. You probably often hear from experts like Bob Belfance and Hetty Chang, who talk about the importance of using data to drive attendance improvement. In New York City, we partnered with New Visions for Public Schools to launch a low-cost early warning data system that sits in Google Docs and hosts attendance, behavior, coursework, and interventions, including success mentors, in real time. Community-based organizations are provisioned access through confidentiality agreements. community-based organizations together with principals use the early warning tool during a weekly attendance meeting to drive results. Now I'm going to pass this back to Sarah Jonas for final takeaways.
Great, next slide. And if we could just, I guess, hit return on those and pull in those key takeaways. Let's see if those come in. So I'll just share the key takeaways. So we've got great, those are coming up now. So a few key takeaways. One, the importance of success mentoring, of partnering chronically absent students and students who are in temporary housing or other vulnerable populations with a caring adult mentor. And again, we found that partnering with institutions of higher learning to engage social work students as success mentors for vulnerable populations is an especially effective strategy. Two, as you just heard my colleague Sarah Peterson share, having some sort of a data dashboard tool that is available to schools and their CBO partners, their community-based partners in this work, is really critical to identifying who those students are who need the support and ensuring that the right students get the supports that they need. Next, the importance of having political champions and flexible funding is really key to success with this type of work and support. And lastly, working together to develop the capacity of community-based partners and schools to work effectively together to support the most vulnerable youth and their families. Thank you. And
hey, Sarah, before we shift over to Ellie, what have you guys found has been the most important for building the capacity of schools to partner with community organizations, and then in return for community organizations to be able to work with schools?
Sure. I can start, and Sarah, please weigh in as well. I think probably the most important is understanding and sort of appreciating the needs of the whole child and the connection between sort of non-academic needs that young people and families have and academic outcomes. So I think that, once that is clear to our schools and sort of, how that whole child plays into academic outcomes for students, schools are much more open, interested, and willing to engage in a deep partnership with community-based organizations that both bring resources to support the whole child and have deep connections with communities that they can leverage to help ensure that students are supported, the whole child is supported to do well in school. And of course, key to that is ensuring that those students come to school on time each day.
And I will also add, I think that's exactly right, and I'll also add that to build the capacity, you have to do it in small bite-sized pieces, because through that, it's much more digestible. The schools see quick wins. They see that a cohort of 10 kids are attending more often, and they see the potential of reaching out to the next 10 kids and the next 10 kids after that. So setting it up in terms of bite-sized pieces and doling it out slowly with a long-term goal in mind, I think is very important.
And Hetty, I'll just add and just one last important piece you asked us as well about community-based organizations. I concur with Sarah and would just add that we found that it's really important for community-based organizations to build their facility with using data to drive decision-making. Our schools use data frequently to make decisions about, which students need which types of academic interventions and supports. And when they see that community-based organizations are similarly data-focused and are adept at using data to both to track the efficacy of interventions and change course when things aren't working, that also builds strong partnerships between schools and community partners.
Thank you so much. We're going to come back to you, but now I have the pleasure of bringing on Ellie Rossetier, who's been a great partner with me and actually in the work here in San Francisco, teaching me a ton about what it means to work in public housing settings. We will come back to these questions about building capacity when we also have an opportunity for cross-cutting dialogue. And I do encourage folks to use the chat to send in their questions. And if you are not speaking, please go on mute. Ellie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I've really enjoyed it so far. So again, I'm Ellie Rossiter, and I am going to talk about HOPE SF, which is a public housing initiative here in San Francisco that takes a collective impact approach to revitalizing and building vibrant communities. So if you will, for a minute, picture a very isolated, dilapidated public housing project built 60 years ago for the city's poorest residents. Most of them are young people of color with limited education, disconnected from the robust set of services and opportunity here in San Francisco. Now imagine this community transformed into vibrant mixed-income neighborhoods with beautiful homes, small local businesses, thriving, productive residents.
Come on.
We are halfway through an effort to rebuild public housing and transform the neighborhoods without displacing the residents who have called these neighborhoods home for so many generations. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what it takes to build a strong partnership between public housing communities and schools and why it matters for student attendance. We'll talk about ways that we brought together previously siloed and fragmented areas of housing and education, health, police, workforce, etc., to address the longstanding trauma, to focus on rebuilding trust, and to implement culturally responsive approaches that improve student attendance and learning. Next slide, please. So because we are transforming neighborhoods without displacing residents, residents live on site before, during, and after construction, and they're part of the effort every step of the way, literally leading change. And we're going to talk about that today. So the kinds of challenges that we talk about are the kinds of challenges that go beyond one agency or one jurisdiction. So Hope SF takes this all-in approach with community, housing developers, nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, which is where I sit, and city agencies, including our school district, health department, police, et cetera, to think about ways to connect family to opportunity. Next slide, please. All of the public housing developments are located in the southeast section of the city, which is very undeveloped and very isolated. Families live geographically, socially, and economically cut off from opportunity. And the isolation is perhaps one of the main contributors to the current reality of trauma in the communities. Extreme poverty, violence, mistrust, and mistrust especially of the systems that have not worked for families for so long. So our schools in these communities are isolated too, and we'll talk about that. And many of them experience the vicarious trauma of the communities. For students, this translates into high chronic absence. 53% when we started this work, more than half of the students living in Hope SF communities were chronically absent. Next slide, please. And to give you a sense of the trauma, let me tell you a story about Ronnie. Ronnie was a 5th grade student last year. He attended the school nearest his Hope SF public housing development, which is where he lives. 5 years ago, Ronnie's dad died. 2 years ago, his 17-year-old brother was shot and killed. Half of the teachers at Ronnie's school left their jobs last year. And he is one of those students who doesn't make it to school some days, and when he does, he often gets sent back home. At only 11 years old, Ronnie has to contend with unimaginable loss. And I'm sure many on this call can relate to this child. Hope SF is working across sectors with the lead of our Department of Public Health to take a trauma-informed approach. The principles that you see on this screen came out of a process led by DPH, the Department of Public Health, that addresses trauma at 3 levels: the systems level, the community level, and the individual level. Like individuals, communities and systems experience trauma directly and vicariously. In a community, it looks like lack of infrastructure and amenities, lack of economic opportunity, and it manifests as a breakdown in trust, social cohesion, and sometimes violence. In our schools, it manifests as high teacher turnover, low enrollment, and poor
hang on. I've got a webinar going. Let me,
Okay, Ellie, you're doing such a fabulous job. Let me try one last time. Could everyone please mute their phone? We can hear you speaking and typing. Thank you.
Our work is guided by a set of principles that have everything to do with building back the trust.
So that would be a no. Where are they going?
Oh. With building
I know, Ellie. You are doing it's such powerful information. Whoever is speaking really needs to mute. Thank you.
You know, I would bow out for Tuesday, Monday.
You know what? I'm going to ask Chantel because this is getting really loud.
All day.
You have an ability to mute everyone and bring Ellie on. Can you try muting everyone and having Ellie come back on?
Yeah. And it would kind of be not smart to not.
Because I don't think Ellie.
Hi, Hetty. I'm trying to unmute Ellie.
Keep going, Ellie. Sorry, this wasn't working.
All right. Thanks for trying. So we are guided by a set of principles that have everything to do with building back the trust that has been broken after so many years of isolation. And in order to build trust, you have to know the community and understand what they go through every day, accept them, and don't push them past their limits. Create a safe place. Don't re-trigger the trauma. Be consistent so people can rely on you. Learn and improve as you go. And you can't just start something and then run out of money and have to stop the program. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about this? The first part of this story is the community story. Early on, we brought resident leaders, residents who live in the community and take employment in the community or just are the natural leaders, those go-to people in the community. We brought them together with Hetty Chang to learn about chronic absenteeism and the implications of 53% chronic absenteeism in these communities. And residents responded with a walking school bus. They trained resident leaders about chronic absenteeism. They developed a route to the 2 elementary schools nearest their housing development. They applied these trauma-informed principles. They did a lot of outreach. They walked the route every single day, rain or shine, kids or no shine, and kids or no kids. And that goes back to that principle around consistency and building trust. They knocked on doors. They made sure that kids get to school in time for breakfast. And let me stress that a walking school bus sounds simple, but it is not simple. This is a serious program that requires planning, money, training, supervision, and constant improvement. The community takes it very seriously at all levels, and they need to because they encounter the serious challenges every single day. Next slide, please. The other part of the story is how we began to bridge schools and community. Each housing site has an education liaison. It is a professional, not a resident. Someone whose background is as a social worker, a former teacher, or community organizer, who is based in the community and not based in the school by design. They link the families with the school. They know the families and the environment they live in. They understand the challenges, and they help bridge the relationships and advocate for students. They're also regarded as a useful resource by both the schools and the families, so they become a central point of contact for everyone. And they're amazing. They meet with parents and they meet with kids. They talk about the barriers to getting to school. And because they are based in the community, they are able to follow up with families because they already know them. So last year, children who met with our education liaison named Betty, they met weekly in a lunch bunch group. By the end of the school year, they showed 95% attendance. Additionally, the 8 elementary schools nearest these 4 Hope SF sites, so generally two elementary schools per Hope SF site, are known as Hope SF schools. The Hope SF school staff and the community-based education liaison work in teams to analyze data, engage parents, message the importance of attendance, and address the needs of chronically absent students. At the end of the school year last year, chronic absence for Hope SF students was 27%, half of what it was 5 years ago. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Ellie, for that powerful presentation. And all 3 of you have given such amazing examples of these vulnerable students who I think sometimes we think it's not possible to change the outcomes for. And yet, that's exactly what you're doing. I'm interested, and again, folks, please feel free to ask questions and put them up into the chat. That would be great. I'm going to open up, ask Sue or Dontel, if you see any questions, please field them over to here. But let me start a question. And when you think about how it's different to work with the most vulnerable kids versus, let's say, kids who are slightly at risk but not in such facing serious challenges, what do you see are some of the differences? How do you need to tailor the strategy differently? And let me start back up with Casey, since you were the first on this webinar. How would you answer that question? How does it look different to change attendance patterns for the most vulnerable kids? How is that different? What do we have to pay special attention to?
This gets back to what I was saying earlier, and this is specific to our work with foster youth, but that really, with the youth with some of the greatest challenges, it's really important that everyone who's involved in the student's life recognizes the role that they can play to support that student and their attendance, because there's so much that can be done on the school side with universal interventions. There's so much that can be done in one-on-one meetings with therapists. There's so much that can be done that the biological family and then relatives can do. And oftentimes, it just takes some coordination and some bringing people together to help them see the role they can play and see how all the pieces fit together. But really, for the youth with some of the greatest challenges, we're not going to, that's where the greatest opportunity is. And that, of course, isn't to say that students with lower levels of challenges wouldn't benefit from similar cross-system collaboration and everyone being on the same page. But I just think it's particularly true for youth with some of the greatest challenges and highest level of need.
Great. And I'm actually going to ask Ellie to answer that question and shift over to New York City, because I see there's actually a message coming in about the training for success mentors. But before I go there, I know, Ellie, you're working in San Francisco, where you've seen this combination of both the more significantly challenged kids as well as kids who are maybe more moderately challenged with absenteeism. What do you see as some of the differences, or how have we had to adjust the strategies?
To adjust the strategies that we have currently placed for the more vulnerable students? Is that the question?
Yeah. What is it? If you were to say, okay, you want to work with these kids who have these really serious levels of chronic absence, who are involved in systems, are there any things you would add to what Casey said about what it takes?
Yeah, I think what I've picked up throughout this whole discussion from each of the presenters, and certainly it's our experience, that it's really about building relationships and building trust. And someone recently said to me that things only move as fast as the speed of trust, and I do think that is so true. That these one-on-one relationships with the students and their families are so key to really encouraging a different kind of outcome. So for us, it's really been about creating more opportunities to build deeper relationships with students and families.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to shift this over to Sarah Jonas or Sarah Peterson. Don't know if you want to add to that, but in particular, that issue of how you build a relationship of trust seems to me that strikes me as it's related to what is the training for success mentors, since so much of their effectiveness is actually dependent on how well they're able to connect with and build trust with the mentees with whom they're assigned. So can you tell us a bit more about that training, and also if there's anything you do differently in the training to make sure it works with kids who are in unstable housing situations?
Sure. This is Sarah Jonas. I can start, and then Sarah Peterson can weigh in as well if she has things to add. So I think a couple of things. I think I mentioned earlier, and I'll just underscore, for all of our mentoring, all of the training we do for success mentors, whether they're mentoring our most vulnerable students, such as students who are experiencing temporary housing challenges, or any student who's experiencing chronic absenteeism, we absolutely focus on that trust-building piece. And one of the key pieces to that we underscore for students, our most vulnerable students, is the consistency of that mentoring relationship. So ensuring that if you start mentoring a student and you are meeting with that student at the same time, a certain time of each day of the week, or every Thursday at 10, the importance of continuing that consistency for those most vulnerable students, because they've experienced so much instability that trust building is predicated on consistency on behalf of the mentor towards how they're supporting their mentee. And it's also important for those students that even when they're improving in their attendance, we train mentors to keep working with those students the same way you have been. Don't let up. Keep that strong, consistent support. We've also, as I mentioned, really embedded content in the training for success mentors working with our most vulnerable students, content specifically related to the types of experiences those students are having. So several times on this call, people mentioned sort of high levels of trauma in this population. So training success mentors in terms of looking for signs of trauma and how to support students in that is really important. We even did a training on transference and countertransference, because we found that our mentors working with our most vulnerable students were sometimes taking on and having adverse reactions themselves in terms of some of what they were hearing from their students, and really internalizing some of the challenges their students were facing. So support around how to kind of mentor those students without taking on what you're hearing in a way that makes it more difficult for you as an individual to provide that support to those students. Domestic violence training has been really key for us as well, and sort of what are the signs of that and how to support students who may be experiencing domestic violence at home. And I mentioned earlier, that piece about, working with the shelter staff. That's been really important as well, because we want the students who are most vulnerable to really experience this strong web of support, both in terms of the consistency and the coordination in terms of the supports that we're providing to them. Lastly, I would just say that, also focusing on prevention. So making sure that mentors not only are gaining strategies for supporting students who are in temporary housing situations, but also strategies to help, identify signs of students who may be on the edge in terms of housing instability, and helping to connect them with resources to prevent them from becoming homeless, mitigating that threat.
And I will just add to that, Hetty, just from a logistics perspective, like all the content that Sarah just named, the menu of trainings that we offer. For our AmeriCorps Success Mentors, which we secured through an Operation AmeriCorps grant, which was also in one of the slides, today we have 73 Success Mentors that span 73 community schools, and they work proactively with at minimum a cohort of 20 mentees. We bring them together on a monthly basis for a full day training. Half the day is on specific success mentoring content, whether it's end of year termination or getting started or case management or connecting to different kinds of agency resources, community resources to support their mentees, kinds of one-on-one trainings, but we also provide them skill building. So we offer offer them chances to develop their resume. We help them kind of map out where they want to be in a year. And we have an example of that with Tylon Washington, who ended up, he was one of our AmeriCorps Success Mentors in 2015-16. He was so effective, we brought him down to the White House for the My Brother's Keeper campaign, ended up being the face of the success mentoring work there, and the video around his work in a high school with Khadijah, who is a student in temporary housing, is on our website. So it's definitely worth taking a look at that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And Sarah, it is 1 o'clock, so I'm going to want to thank all of our panelists for their excellent comments, the presentations. Dontel said it will be up on the website, and she'll also email it out to folks who participated in the webinar. This was such rich information. We will take into account and we'll think about how we can improve the use of technology in this, but I do want to thank everyone for participating, and especially all of our panelists for the fabulous information that they've offered, and for Dontel and the Everyone Graduate Center and for the National Technical Assistance Center in all your work to host this webinar today. Thank you so much.
Yay, it's over. No, I do not want that.